Pancake, everyone! NASA missions in the second half of the 1960s were quite active and successful. The United States was determined to win the battle for the moon. Thousands of people were doing everything necessary to send the first people to the moon. On July 20, 1969, the Apollo 11 mission achieved its goals, Armstrong and Aldrin successfully landing the lunar module on the surface of our satellite. Now it's worth learning more about his follower, Apollo 12. Let's plunge into this story and find out about the second expedition to the moon. But before we start, let's find out what kind of ship this is. Apollo 12. Apollo 12 is a manned spacecraft, during the flight of which, in 1969, people landed on the surface of another celestial body, the moon, for the second time in history. The crew consisted of Commander Charles Conrad, who flew for the third time, the pilot of the command module Richard Gordon, and the pilot of the lunar module Alan Bean. Conrad and Gordon are experienced astronauts who have completed the Gemini program. Initially, I trained with them in the Troika. Clifton Williams, however, he died in a plane crash. At Conrad's personal suggestion, starting with the backup crew, Apollo 9, Williams was replaced by Alan Bean, who hadn't flown before. Conrad had known Bean well since the early 60s, when he worked as an instructor at the Test Pilot School, and Bean was his student. All crew members were officers of the US Navy, which influenced the name of the ship and the symbolism of the mission. General information about the ship. The ship included a command module, Sample 108, and a lunar module, Sample LM6. For the command module, the astronauts chose the call sign Yankee Clipper. For the lunar module, Intrepid, the names of the ships of the American Navy that distinguished themselves in battles. The purpose of the flight was to land on the moon and conduct research on a broader program than during the flight of the Apollo 11 spacecraft. They provided for landing on the moon in the Ocean of Storms, about 1540 kilometers west of the landing site of the Apollo 11 spacecraft, collecting samples of the lunar soil, photographing on the surface of the moon, installing scientific instruments on the moon, photographing the surface of the moon from a cylindrical orbit, in particular some sites selected for subsequent landings of the Apollo series ships. The search for the automatic spacecraft Surveyor 3 landed on the moon on April 20, 1967. The dismantling of some parts of the specified apparatus and their delivery to Earth to study the effects of prolonged state in lunar conditions, conducting television sessions from the ship and from the surface of the moon. The flight program was almost completed. Due to malfunction of the television camera, it was not possible to conduct 2 scheduled color television sessions from the moon. Pre-launch preparation proceeded normally until November 12, when a leak was detected in a tank with liquid hydrogen for fuel cells. On November 13, the faulty tank was replaced by another, dismantled from the Apollo 13 spacecraft, which at that time was being checked in the building for vertical assembly. After replacing the tank, pre-start preparation was normal. President Nixon was among the honored guests at the Launch Control Center. About 300,000 people watched the launch at the Cosmodrome and in the surrounding areas. Despite the meteorological conditions, rain, low thunderstorm clouds, launch was decided not to be postponed, since at the next possible launch date it would have been necessary to abandon landing in the area of the Surveyor 3 spacecraft. The Apollo 12 spacecraft launched on November 14, 1969 at 16:22 GMT at 670 seconds later than the estimated time. In the first minute of the flight, an emergency situation arose due to atmospheric electrical discharges at the 37th and 53rd seconds of the flight. The discharges caused an emergency shutdown of the ship's fuel cells, Bean turned them on manually again in the second minute of the flight, and disabled some of the ship's sensors. The second discharge led to the fact that the gyroscopes of the guidance and navigation systems of the ship stood on the stops. The gyro platform of the guidance and navigation system was reconfigured later based on star observations. Electrical discharges did not affect the operation of the guidance system of the launch vehicle. The ship was placed into geocentric orbit close to the calculated one. After the launch of the last stage of the launch vehicle with the spacecraft into initial geocentric orbit, the crew checked the onboard systems for about 2 hours, paying special attention to the search for possible damage as a result of electrical discharges. The check didn't reveal any significant malfunctions. At the third hour of the flight, the engine of the last stage was turned on a second time and brought the stage with the ship on a flight path to the moon. After the maneuver of rebuilding the compartments, the ship was taken to a safe distance from the last stage of the launch vehicle and began an independent flight to the moon. During the flight, the systems of the lunar module, which were not provided for by the initial program, were checked. In particular, electric discharge damage was feared during the launch of the electronic radar system. The checks show that the onboard systems of the lunar module are working properly. Conrad and Bean moved into the lunar module about 4 hours before the module undocked with the command module. The undocking occurred at the 108th hour of the flight. The modules were separated from each other at a distance of about 5 kilometers. At the 110th hour of the flight, the engine of the lunar module landing stage was turned on and the automatic landing program began working out. At an altitude of 162 meters above the surface of the moon, the development of a semi-automatic landing program began. The onboard equipment of the lunar module worked extremely efficiently. In particular, Conrad reported that if the automatic landing program had continued to be worked out, such a possibility was provided, the lunar module would have descended directly onto the Surveyor 3 spacecraft. Conrad decided to fly over the Surveyor 3 spacecraft and land the lunar module at the opposite edge of the crater in which the spacecraft was located. Conrad was observing the area through the porthole, while Bean was reading aloud the readings of the instruments. At an altitude of about 40 meters, a little more than 130 feet, the jet of the engine began to raise a cloud of dust from the surface of the moon. Then the raised dust almost hit the surface, and as a result, Conrad landed the module closer to the edge of the crater than he intended. The moon landing took place on November 19, 1969 at 6 hours 54 minutes 43 seconds GMT. The onboard landing time is 110 hours 32 minutes 43 seconds. The lunar module descended 45 meters from the edge of the crater at a distance of about 200 meters from the spacecraft Surveyor 3. After landing, the astronauts were ready to make an emergency launch from the moon for several minutes. Since the situation didn't require an emergency launch, the astronauts received permission from the control center and began to prepare for their first trip to the moon. Conrad was the first to descend to the surface of the moon at the onboard time of 115 hours 22 minutes. They expected from him a historical phrase similar to the one uttered by Neil Armstrong. "This is one small step for a person, but a giant leap for all mankind." But Conrad, recalling Armstrong's words and hinting at his small stature, said. Later on the ground, he admitted that he had bet $500 with Oriana Fallaci that he would say exactly that to prove to her that Armstrong's phrase was not imposed on him in advance and that the NASA leadership does not program astronauts when and what to say. He added that he was not going to take the money at all. But to be quite precise, Armstrong's phrase refers specifically to the first step, and Conrad uttered his words after jumping off the last step. The step at the same time turned out to be at the level of his belt. He didn't say the word step. When he took a step, he added, "Oh, she's soft and gentle." Conrad collected the first samples of lunar soil. His feet sank deep into the moon dust, and he had to leave them high when walking. Dust settled on the spacesuit and all the objects used by the astronauts. According to their estimates, the depth of the dust layer was much greater than at the landing site of the Apollo 11 spacecraft. Bean descended to the surface of the moon about half an hour after Conrad and began to transfer the color television camera to be mounted on a tripod. At the same time, the camera failed. Having worked for about half an hour before, all attempts to fix the camera were unsuccessful. One of the astronauts even slightly hit the camera with a hammer camera, which caused color stripes to appear on the screen, but then the image disappeared again. Experts on Earth assume that the photosensitive layer of the tube suffered as a result of the camera being accidentally pointed at the sun or at the body of the lunar module reflecting the sun's rays for 10-15 seconds. Attempts to fix the camera continued during the astronauts' second trip to the surface of the moon, but they also didn't bring success. The camera was returned to Earth to analyze the causes of the malfunction. For this, the astronauts subsequently had to leave about 6 kilograms of lunar soil collected during the first exit on the moon. Bean and Conrad installed scientific instruments on the surface of the moon, collected an additional set of samples of lunar soil. Bean, out of mischief, threw a foam capping of one of the instruments. According to him, it reached a height of about 100 meters. The astronauts' first trip to the moon's surface lasted about 4 hours. At the same time, the reserves of the autonomous knapsack life support system were not completely used up. Returning to the lunar module after the first exit, the astronauts recharged the autonomous life support systems with water and oxygen. After a meal, a nap, Conrad slept in a spacesuit, afraid removing it to spread moon dust around the cabin. And another meal, the astronauts began to prepare for the second exit to the surface of the moon. The hatch was opened at 131 hours, 32 minutes, 0 seconds of onboard time. Conrad descended to the surface of the moon in about 8 minutes, Bean in 15. The astronauts corrected one of the scientific instruments, a fallen ionization pressure gauge, and began collecting soil samples while commenting on the nature of the terrain. Conrad rolled small rocks into the craters twice, which was recorded by the seismometer installed by the astronauts during the first exit. Astronauts have found that it is easier to collect samples not with the help of tools but with their hands. When one of them bent down to take a sample, the other held it by the strap. Conrad fell once, but as he noted, the fall on the moon is so slow that there is no danger of tearing the spacesuit on the rocks. Approaching the edge of the crater where the Surveyor 3 spacecraft was located, the astronauts began their descent. The soil on the slope turned out to be strong and unloose, so no safety net with a rope was needed. Approaching the spacecraft, the astronauts reported that it was not white as it launched, but brown, while the ground around it was gray. The astronauts photographed and examined the device, and as planned, dismantled some of its parts, including the camera. On the way back to the lunar module, the astronauts continued collecting samples. During the second exit, the total length of the astronauts' route was approximately 1.5 kilometers. The duration of the exit was 3 hours and 54 minutes. About an hour after the end of the second exit, the astronauts again depressurized the cabin of the lunar module and opened the hatch to throw out the objects that had become unnecessary. At the same time, one film was thrown out by mistake. Initially, it was assumed that the astronauts threw away the captured film, but later it turned out that an unexposed one was thrown out. But before we continue, we advise you to like the video and leave a comment with your thoughts about this video. This will greatly help us in the development of the channel. The launch from the moon was made at 142 hours, 03 minutes, 47 seconds of flight time. The time spent on the moon was 31 hours, 31 minutes, 04 seconds. The docking of the lunar module's takeoff stage and the command module was carried out at 146 hours of flight. The rendezvous, filmed from the command module by Richard Gordon, was broadcast on television. Conrad and Bean, after vacuuming their spacesuits and objects carried to the crew compartment, moved to this compartment 2 hours after docking. About an hour later, the command module and the lunar module's takeoff stage were undocked. The command module was taken to a safe distance with the help of auxiliary engines. Then, on a command from Earth, the engine of the takeoff stage was turned on for braking, and as planned, it fell to the moon. The fall was recorded by instruments installed by the crew on the moon. At 173rd hour of flight during the 46th orbit of the command module around the moon, the main engine was turned on, which put the ship on a flight path to Earth. The separation of the crew compartment from the surface compartment of the command module occurred at the 245th hour of the flight. The crew compartment was brought down in 244 hours, 25 minutes, 46 36 seconds of flight time, 4.5 kilometers from the aircraft carrier Hornet in the Pacific Ocean. On the water, the crew compartment was initially installed in an accountable position, bottom up, but after a few minutes, with the help of inflatable balloon floats, it was turned over to the calculated position. When turning over, a movie camera fell off the bracket and cut Bean's eyebrow. Later, the astronaut was given 2 stitches. Light divers brought a pontoon under the compartment, gave the astronauts clean overalls and masks with respirators through the hatch. During the flights of the Apollo 11, 12, 14 ships, quarantine measures were taken for fear of bringing dangerous microorganisms to Earth. But since no microorganisms were detected, starting with the flight of the Apollo 15 spacecraft, strict post-flight quarantine measures for astronauts and samples were cancelled. The helicopter delivered the ship's crew aboard the aircraft carrier 1 hour and 10 minutes after the landing. The advantages of exploring the moon with the participation of astronauts were demonstrated. Without their participation, it would not have been possible to install the instruments in the most suitable place and ensure their normal functioning. The study of the parts of the Surveyor 3 spacecraft dismantled by astronauts showed that they were exposed to very insignificant meteor particles for about 1,000 days on the moon. In a piece of foam placed in a nutrient medium, bacteria from among those living in the human mouth and nose were found. Obviously, the bacteria got into the foam during the pre-flight repair of the device with exhaled air or saliva of one of the technicians. Thus, it turned out that, once again in a selective environment, terrestrial bacteria are able to reproduce after almost 3 years of staying in lunar conditions. However, there is also an assumption that the bacteria were introduced to the part after its return to Earth. In the first half of 1970, NASA organized the distribution of 1,620 samples of lunar soil, delivered by astronauts with a total weight of 13 kilograms for research in laboratories in Australia, Belgium, Canada, Czechoslovakia, Finland, West Germany, Japan, Korea, Spain, Switzerland, Great Britain, South Africa, Italy, France, Norway, India, and the USA. The topic of space is incredibly extensive and interesting. Write in the comments if you would like to fly to the moon yourself or would prefer to stay at home and drink hot cocoa. Don't forget to like the video, it will greatly help us in the development of this channel. In the meantime, there was Tulip Pancake with you, good mood and fair wind to everyone. See you soon.